she pronouns, and I'm recording in progress. And I use they, she pronouns, and I'm with Resist US Led War Seattle. And I will be one of your facilitators today, along with.
I'm the other facilitator. I'm Tessa. My pronouns are she, her, and I am also in Resist Seattle.
And Tracy, would you like to?
Hi everyone, my name is Tracy. I'm with Anak Bayan UW, and I'm here as a lead of the Political Education Committee as part of the No2DSS campaign coalition.
Great, yeah, and we're really excited for what we have for everyone today. And also shout out to Cami and Susie who are doing tech. Susie will be monitoring the chat, and Cami is doing some other tech stuff as well. And before we go on, I want to give a little bit of a content warning. Of course, when we're talking about imperialism and weapons transnational corporations, we'll be talking about violence, genocide, and some other distressing topics. Now to get into it. So this slide says Seattle says no to DSS, and unfortunately that's not fully true because some people in Seattle are profiting off of genocide and other war crimes. And DSS, of course, means the Defense Supplier Summit that Boeing is hosting March 12th to 14th right here at the Washington Convention Center. So with that in mind, let's go on. Next slide. And before we get into concepts like war and imperialism and settler colonialism, of course, we want to take time to acknowledge that in Seattle, we are on stolen lands of the Coast Salish peoples. And when we're learning about imperialism and thinking about the vastness and how it works, we really want to remember the stolen land and also try to learn more about it so we can prevent any other attacks on Indigenous sovereignty in the future. And I think about the Native elders who were at the Rafa protest on Saturday, talking about the interconnectedness of our struggles and with Palestine and with other liberation struggles that are happening around the world. And y'all, feel free to interact in the chat. This is going to be a pretty interactive presentation, but just to let y'all know that. Next slide. And grounding is why we're here today, as we all are acutely aware of, in just 143 days in Gaza and occupied Palestine, the Zionist project has killed over 30,000 people, and at least 10,000 of which are children. Tens of thousands more are maimed. Infrastructure, universities, hospitals destroyed. Family lines destroyed as well, and 2 million displaced and facing famine. And of course, we've been bearing witness for this for the past 143 days. And of course, since 80 years, over 80 years since the Zionist project started. And of course, you have a picture here of an example of that devastation in Khan Yunis. And while we're thinking about this devastation, remembering that Boeing is directly responsible for a lot of the destruction and murders that have happened. And Boeing in our backyard, we're speeding up delivery for bombs used to murder civilians and resistance fighters in Palestine. And we all have a lot of grief, and we all have a lot of anger around this. And that's part of why we're here. And we want to do something about that, right? We want to take that grief and that anger, we want to channel it into something so that we can try and prevent things like this from happening. So next slide. So what we're trying to do is mobilize for the Defense Suppliers Summit. I think about the irony of this headline that I saw a few weeks ago: Boeing CEO fights back tears admitting their mistake for the door plug blowout with Alaska Airlines. You see them crying over the mistakes of their shoddy business practices, but you don't see them shed a single tear about any of the murders of people that their weapons caused, because of course that's exactly what they're designed to do, to cause as much destruction as possible. And Dave Calhoun is a war criminal, and we're angry about that, right? We're done, and we don't want any more lives in Palestine or any other oppressed peoples lost. We don't want any more profiting from that. Not only are they engaged in this, they're also profiting off this genocide. And That's why we're here together, to learn more about how we can disrupt it and why we need to disrupt it. Next slide. And so an outline of what today is going to look like. First, we're going to talk more about resist US-led wars, points of unity, and then we'll go into, I'll give a deep dive into imperialism, going to the 5 features of imperialism. Then we'll talk more about weapons transnational corporations, WTNCs, and specific, Tesla will go into that, and then talk about Boeing and DSS and our campaign for No2DSS. Next slide. So Resist US-led War is a national organization, and we have a unit in Seattle, and we have 2 points. The Resist US-led War has 2 points of unity. Next slide. Our first is Resist US-led War. Can I have a volunteer to read this slide? You can maybe raise your hand, and I can, or you can just unmute. Okay, L.
1. Resist US-led war and militarism, including with the withdrawal of US military troops, occupation, bases, war games, and exercises in West Asia, Africa, East, Central, and South Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands, and East Europe. Resist US, NATO, AFRICOM, and CIA counterinsurgency operations, proxy wars, and other forms of covert intervention. Fight Zionism, apartheid, and systemic racism. Fight against the US military-industrial complex, including divestment from the hundreds of billions spent on war and militarization, and redirecting of public funds towards people's needs, development, and infrastructure.
Beautiful, thank you, Elle. Yes, so fighting against the military-industrial complex and diverting and those public funds towards people's needs, really seeing that, contextualizing the wars of aggression against oppressed peoples, and knowing that we could do so much better with the taxpayer dollars that we give to this. Right, next slide. Mic drop, yeah. All right, number 2, can I have a volunteer for number 2? Iris.
Build just peace. Through justice, social equity, and solidarity amongst peoples, including the recognition of the right to self-determination, economic and food sovereignty, and self-defense of nations and oppressed peoples from reactionary aggression and violence. Build peace through genuine sustainable, job creation, and the health and well-being of our communities.
Yes, thank you. Building just peace. So an important aspect of this is recognizing the right for oppressed people to resist against aggression from imperial nations. And we'll talk more about that as we're working through this presentation. Yep. Next slide. Okay, so we're gonna do a little bit of an experiment here. Like I said, want this to be interactive, not only because it makes presentations more interesting, but also because we know that there's a lot of knowledge in this space of anti-imperialists that we have gathered here today. So what we're going to do is want you to think of a word. It can be the first word or a really powerful word that comes to mind when you think of imperialism. And then Cami is going to open up a whiteboard, and we are going to create a great general collage of what these words are. So let's give that a try. So thinking, what comes to mind? Imperialism. Yeah, and if you want to throw that in the chat, that's fine. But there's a text box here that you can add, and I have a text here. Let's see. Is that working for people? Can I get a thumbs up? Either in the chat. Okay, we got yes. And just so you know, how you control it when you zoom in, zoom out, that's just you. You're not controlling it for everybody. It's going to look a little bit different for everyone. Okay, oh yeah, thank you for starting the timer, Cami. Okay, I'm seeing violence, exploitation, white supremacy, hierarchy, desolation, colonialism, economic dependency / underdevelopment, hierarchy, destruction, theft, war, ethnic cleansing. Yeah, these are all great examples. It's going really well. Super exploitation, neocolonialism, greed, paternalism, extraction, capitalism, suffering, monopolies, ecological destruction, weapons. Yeah, and A and B, thank you. If you want to use a chat, that's also totally cool too. Markets, tech products, yeah. United States. Okay, so yeah, I see sexual and gender-based violence. Yeah, erasure. I see someone using different. Yeah, so thank you everyone for contributing what you think, and I'm glad we did this because we're going to touch on a lot of these topics, especially economic dependency, violence, destruction, environmental degradation. Those are all things that we're going to talk about, and I think it's important to note how kind of different that those all are, and that's because it has a lot to do with how wide-reaching and how ubiquitous imperialism is. So thank you for that, for letting us do that experiment. It worked out really well, and I think that also you will get a copy of that sent to your email afterwards, which is kind of nifty. So something that we all created together to help us kind of remember what we're learning about with imperialism. Yeah. Okay. So now, next slide. So I kind of did that activity, and before we defined imperialism, because what we're going to do today is really dig in and define what imperialism is. And if you look at this political cartoon on the right side here, this is probably what you're thinking of, what a lot of people might think of with imperialism. You have this imperial core, which is where imperial power is being concentrated. In this example, it's England. Think about the British Empire as having a lot of imperial power. And I'll also refer to right now, the imperial core is really the United States, where a lot of the imperial power in the world is concentrated. And I'm also going to refer to imperial nations, which is a lot of countries in Western Europe that are also engaged in imperialism around the world. And this is kind of what we think of. We think of them kind of going out and grabbing land. And this is definitely a part of imperialism, but we really want to think about imperialism as this like expansive economic system, the monopoly stage of capitalism. And capitalism, to be more granular, just make sure we're on the all same page at a micro level, is workers selling their labor to a class, like bosses, owners, CEOs. I'll refer to that as the ruling class, in order to live. And over time, the ruling class accumulates more and more profit at the expense of workers, and then the ruling class controls the whole relationships and become more and more rich and get more and more wealth, while the working class does not get more wealth and struggle to get by. And so we're thinking of imperialism as a monopoly or kind of macro form of that capitalism kind of existing around the globe. And so this is marked by 5 features: monopolies, finance rules, export of capital, economic division of the world, and territorial division of the world. And these are quite complex, but just wanting to remember that really expansion and profit are the goals of imperial nations. And a lot of these are in order to expand and create more and more wealth for the imperial core and for imperial nations. And the first stage, next slide, is monopolies. So monopolies are defined as having an exclusive control over a supply. And a good example is when you're in the grocery store and you're trying to pick out a cereal and you think you have all these different choices. It's actually quite an illusion, because the grocery aisle is only owned by a handful of corporations, including General Mills, Nestle. And the reason why, so they are really dominating the food industry. And the reason why monopolization is important for them is so that they can control the markets, make more profits, maybe control prices as well. And so that's, if we're thinking about a good way to think about monopolies that you might encounter in your everyday life. Next slide. And so we talked about food as an industry, but now we want to think more about war as an industry, as awful as that sounds. So we have weapons transnational corporations that are really the arbiters of that. They're companies with global operations, overseeing and profiting from the industrial mass production of high-tech weapons of war. If, for example, Boeing. And monopolization has also benefited weapons transnational corporations, WTNCs for short. It's quite a mouthful. And this consolidation has happened, and click, Kimmy. In the 1990s, there were 51 main defense contractors in the US to 5 today, which are Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Northrop. Yes, I can slow down for sure. Thank you. I need that reminder. So yeah, we have 51 main defense contractors to 5. And this industry of war is actually paid for by taxpayer dollars. 71% of the revenue is made in public contracts. And they can't increase their profits unless war is being waged in which they're against oppressed peoples, in which their weapons are being used for example, genocide in Palestine. That's the only way for them to make more profit. And it's important for them to monopolies exist for imperialism because they allow TNCs and weapons WTNCs to hold more sway over areas. They're able to lobby for more funding, and it's easier for them to assert their dominance, more power concentrated in fewer hands. But this obviously makes them a lot more vulnerable because in order for them to increase their profits, they usually have to cut costs and engage in lots of funky supply chain stuff that we'll talk about more later in the presentation. And can you click for the article? And actually, the Pentagon has put out reports saying how vulnerable this is making for quote unquote national security, that this consolidation has happened. So really, really just exploitative all around. And then as these profits are increasing and because of this monopolization, it leads to finance. The next slide, please. This increased, in order to increase their profits, WTNCs need finance capital, and finance capital is money used to make more money, such as investments and bonds. And so you see Wall Street pouring over $600 million into defense contracts and WTNCs since the war on Gaza, and banks just really helping accumulate all of this wealth for these transnational corporations and just creating more and more power. And as this capital is increasing and profits can't be maximized anymore within where the land is of the imperial nations and imperial cores, this leads to the next slide, which is the export of capital. And this is where you're seeing even more exploitation. And this is WTNCs and also banks seeing the world not as people or sovereign nations, but as places to grab resources and labor, providing profit. For example, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, under the guise of quote unquote sustainable development, are giving these predatory loans out and putting these capital projects in places like the Philippines and Peru and Chad and Cameroon, developing these industries that are all for the benefit of getting more profits to the imperial core, the imperial nations, and keeping them compliant because of that. And bauxite is related specifically to WTNCs because aluminum it comes from bauxite, and Boeing needs a lot of aluminum for its weapons. And a lot of reports how people are displaced. And obviously, this is super awful for the environment and super awful for the workers that live there. But all under the guise, again, of sustainable development. We're doing this because it's good for you, when actuality, like what they need is reparations, because they've had generations of being exploited by imperial nations. Really just so messed up. I could do this for a while, but yeah. And as these imperial nations are doing more business in different places, they are bound to run into each other, and that's what leads to the economic division of the world. And this happens a lot with free trade agreements. For example, the North American Free Trade Agreement, you have the African Union, you have the APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Coalition, and you have to think about, they bet all these, they're called free trade agreements, but you have to think free for whom? And it's free for war profiteering corporations like Boeing. These free trade agreements deregulate protections for the environment, protections for workers, and gives more power to the imperial courts to inflict their damage. And this is obviously a direct threat to indigenous sovereignty. I think about the Zapatistas, who are the indigenous army in Mexico, in group in Mexico, responding to NAFTA, which was 30 years ago on in January 1st of this year, responding to NAFTA. Absolutely not, because they knew that it was going to threaten their ways of life, and that the imperial core was going to try and get these use these exploitative practices against their people, and the Zapatistas with their autonomy still to this day. And this endangering of indigenous sovereignty leads us straight into the territorial division of the world, which is the next slide. No to APEC, yeah. And this territorial division of the world, so people being sovereign over their own lands, is not good for business, it's not good for profit, and this always leads to aggression from imperial cores. So when empires are doing business, they'll often use their means in order to break sovereignty, which is a direct threat to their profit, their wealth. And obviously we can see the Zionist project in occupied using strategies in occupied Palestine, such as settler colonialism and military occupation, for over 100, yeah, honestly, over 100 years. And Sammy Dune is also going to do a teach-in this week about Boeing and Palestine. So looking forward to that. And remembering that, to go back, so here's the apartheid border, and who is financing this military occupation, financing and also arming this military occupation and this war and these apartheid walls? It's WTNCs. It's WTNCs that are needing these wars and this aggression against peoples in order to make profits and further increase their profits over time. Next slide. Yeah, and so we see military alliances. We've talked about free trade agreements, but thinking about military alliances like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, really putting all the resources into the war in Ukraine and making spheres of influence to increase their power, and also RIMPAC, the Rim of the Pacific, which is a military exercise that takes place in Hawaii, and which is 26 nations uniting to engage in war exercises, because real war isn't enough. They also have to practice it, which is so weird. But using, and of course, who's providing all of the weapons and arms? WTNCs, like our Boeing. And I think about, again, to reiterate the point of territory division of the world, you can click through for the articles. Thinking about how when in solidarity, the Houthis in Yemen attacked the Israel-bound vessels in the Red Sea, the U.S. not only conducted airstrikes, one of which happened today actually, which is killing people. They also engaged in a maritime attack as well, which they nicknamed, quote unquote, prosperity guardian. So they're not even trying to hide the fact that they care more about commerce and they care about lives in Palestine. So yeah, that's really messed up and terrible. And just reiterating from our points of unity that resistance for national liberation is just, and resistance against WTNCs and imperial course is just. Next slide. No to RIMPAC, yeah. Okay, so we just went through a lot, and I think it's important to remember you don't have to be an economic expert in order to resist against WTNCs, but it is really important to understand imperialism and how expansive it is and how it works to a certain extent, just so we can really make our resistance against the weapons suppliers, WTNCs, more effective. And remembering that for WTNCs, the profits are in dollars and the losses are in lives. Okay, I'm take a little breath here. Great. Next slide. So now we went through a lot of information, so get some interactivity into it again. On this slide, we have a picture on the left, and that's American troops in Vietnam. On the bottom, American troop in Vietnam, and on the right, Spanish-American War. And I want in the chat for us to write, how is US militarism framed? When the military is going and doing these different invasions, what are they saying that they're doing this for? Why are they doing this? What might be some reasons? Write those in the chat. Freedom, democracy, safety, protecting democracy, protecting women, yeah, security, stopping terrorism, manifest destiny, development, for everyone's benefit. Yeah, that was good. Human rights, anti-communism, yeah, peace, civilization, US security, to help poverty in a country, yeah, self-determination. Yeah, these are great. These are so great. Great examples. Activist repression, because we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. Yes, it's not terrorism when we do it, but it's terrorism when you do it. Yes, thank you so much. I think it's important to think about that, and especially so you know, thinking about maybe even where are some places that you're hearing these narratives. Get some examples of where might you hear these narratives. CNN, New York Times, mainstream media networks, exactly. Yeah, so it's being fed to us. It's not just discourse that you hear from other people, but it's coming from these huge media outlets too. All right, thank you for that. Next slide. Oval Office, yo, for real. Yeah, and just remembering how US militarism, we were talking about it around the world, just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that obviously like militarism affects us in the US too, and is harming and killing Black and brown folks and working class folks here. And from Cop City in Atlanta to the Cop City that they're trying to make in Lacey, Washington too. All right, next slide. Okay, all right, time for some guesses here. And if you know the answer, then, all right, wait, never mind. Okay, how much did the US spend on defense in fiscal year 2022? Guesses in the chat, please. Thank you, Susie. Anyone? Okay, 89 billion, 2 billion, 800 plus billion, 40 billion. Okay, so we're all in agreement about billions, it seems. Too much. 1 trillion, 858 billion. Okay, so drum roll, like snap or something. Yes, it is. I think the closest was I can't remember what it is, but yeah. Next slide. The answer is $877 billion. Yeah. Oof, that is quite a lot. I know someone said 1 trillion, and I was like, no way. And I was like, we're so close. We're actually so close to 1 trillion. So not even that. And Yeah, more than the next 10 countries combined. And what is this money going towards? It's going towards weapons transfer and research. Hint, Boeing. Intelligence, personnel. And also this this figure does not include foreign military aid. So this isn't even like the full picture. So it probably is more than $1 trillion, but this is just on what has been reported for kind of internal things. And yeah, there's no reason that you need to spend this much on defense unless you were trying to utterly dominate the entire world. Like, there's just no other way to say it. And because really, more than the next 10 countries combined, but also that almost 4 times China, which would be the next one. So yeah, I remember seeing this for the first time and being very, very astounded as well. And let's dig more into that. Next slide. Yeah, defense. How is war used to maintain US imperialism? I know when I'm American because when I walk into a room, something dies. That's from a Palestinian American poet, Noor Hindi. And I remember reading this poem, which you should read the entire poem, but kind of like that part really stopping me in my tracks because of how visceral that quote is. And I think this illustration really illustrates the far-reaching nature of US imperialism and kind of the death and destruction that US imperialism causes. 750 bases in at least 80 countries around the world and approximately 173,000 troops deployed. And again, no reason to do that except for complete political dominance and also economic dominance. You have to think also about, remember, we'll talk more about this, but supply chains, because in the places where these US bases are located are places that are also places where corporations are extracting labor and resources and people are fighting back. And the US needs militarism and more weapons in order to like continue that oppression and make them so that they can continue to exploit those people and the resources. And next slide. And this slide kind of drives that point home here as well. So you see, this is these are different places where Boeing is presented. If you, let's just take a little long look at this and then go back to the previous slide. Go to the previous slide. Those look, I don't know about you, those look really similar to me. A lot of concentration in Africa and West Asia, in different places throughout the Americas too. And next slide. Oh, can you go back for a second? Yeah, and this is just Boeing. This isn't even the other 4 WTNCs as well. So just remembering the sort of the power and that is consolidated with WTNCs and both the state and imperial nations around the world. But yeah, so we talked a lot about, again, imperialism and militarism. Now I'm going to pass it off to my good friend Tessa to talk more about these.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Heat, for that intro and that amazing explanation of imperialism and US militarism. So like Heat said, WTNCs are essential to the US's military strategy, right? And the US spent $877 billion on its domestic military in 2022, but it also spends a lot of time and money making sure that these weapons get into the hands of its allies. And so WTNC products are sent worldwide. There are 3, and the reason that they do this is because they're the tools that enable capitalist imperialism. Like, that's it. Materially, WTNC products are what cause the destruction that enables the imposition of capitalism. So there's 3 main ways that WTNC weapons are distributed globally. The first one is foreign military. Actually, I should say there's 3 legal, publicly known ways that WTNC products are distributed around the world. It's not unheard of for the US government to transfer arms secretly. So when you're looking at stuff that we have public records for, there's these three. So the first is foreign military aid, which is at no cost to the recipient country. It's on our dime. US taxpayers pay for it. And it normally goes towards purchasing weapons and then also training police and military. WTNC, thank you for asking. It's Weapons Transnational Corporation. So a transnational corporation is yeah, a company that operates in multiple countries. The second one is foreign military sales. Oh, sorry, what I was going to say. The foreign military aid is also spent on police and military who go on to become very loyal clients of US-based WTNCs. The second option is foreign military sales, where the US military will sell weapons and products that it no longer wants or needs to foreign countries. And the third option is direct commercial sales, where WTNCs are essentially selling directly to a foreign country, but it has to be approved by the State Department. Okay, question. You can, actually, let's go to the next slide first. Okay, this is going to be questions for the chat. We're going to do countdown of the top 4 countries that received the most foreign military aid, which again is just that first category that taxpayers pay for in 2022. This is on top of the $877 billion that the US spends on its own military function every year. Guesses in chat. Which country do you think got the most money in 2022 at $3.3 billion? Okay, yeah, I'm seeing a lot of mostly agreement in the chat. Cami, you can click. So yeah, the first one is Israel. And the second one is what a lot of other people were suspecting. So go ahead and click that one too, Ukraine. Third and fourth are a bit trickier. Does anyone want to try those? 1.2 billion. That's what we're getting to next. Yeah. Pete is right on the money. Number 3 is Egypt at 1.2 billion. And any guesses for number 4? I haven't seen it in the chat yet. Okay. You can click. It is actually Jordan. So a few things I want to point out here. These are all massive amounts of money, obviously. There are a lot of really good guesses in the chat that are not as high on this list, like Saudi Arabia and South Korea, because I think they get more of their weapons from direct sales and from buying from WTNCs. But the foreign military aid really shows US strategic priorities, right? So even though 2022 was when the war in Ukraine was in full swing and the genocide in Gaza had not yet started, Israel was still receiving more than twice as much money as Ukraine, because that's how important it is just in general to the US strategic objectives. It's also important to note that numbers 3 and 4 are the border countries of Israel, and Egypt and Jordan play a really, really important role in US foreign policy in terms of normalizing the Israeli occupation, normalizing relationships with Israel, promoting capitalism in the region, and absorbing refugees to make the occupation of Palestine and also US interventions in neighboring countries seem more, basically not get as much attention, because if refugees are going to Jordan, they're not going to Europe, right? Okay, you can, yeah, click. Yes, out of Taiwan, hands off China, border countries of Palestine. Yes, sorry, did I not say that? Military aid is not just spending on weapons and personnel. Well, I don't know what you mean by that, but it can go to purchasing weapons. It can also go towards like training. I don't know if it can be used on propaganda. This is the full map. So you can see those 4 countries and then the other places where US military aid went. And again, it has a lot in common with those other maps we've looked at about partnerships of US military bases, etc. Next slide. Okay, so WTNCs obviously play a very important role in the maintenance of US imperialism because their products are used to spread capitalist imperialism by force and in line with US strategic objectives. Because a lot of that military aid is going to purchasing weapons from US-based WTNCs, these WTNCs are literally invested in US imperialism. Like they cannot function successfully, which means they can't make a profit. And they can't make a profit without war, without continuing aggression, without expanding aggression, because that's what capitalism relies on, right? Expansion. This map on the left, it shows the places where the US has, it shows major American wars and other military conflicts. It's already a shocking amount of the world that is taken up, but it's even more wild when you think about the fact that this map doesn't include places where the US has supported dictators, funded proxy wars, funded militias, interfered in elections, backed a coup, which it has done in almost every country that's not filled in on this map. I would also add that the first country the US military ever invaded was the US in its conquest and genocide of indigenous people. So that's another thing you have to think about. US imperialism has always been at the core of this country. So the products made by WTNCs serve a double purpose. They're used by the USA and its allies to crush opposition to capitalist imperialism, to repress it, and then also to forcefully open new markets to sell, and also to labor markets. At the moment, and this is a very, very incomplete list, but just to give you an idea, WTNC products are being used now to kill people in Palestine, the Philippines, Yemen, the Congo, Kashmir, Ethiopia, so many countries, it's hard to name them, but it's the present day reflection of this map, right? Like war is everywhere US strategic interests are. And the last thing I want to point out is that WTNCs obviously play a major role in war. They're also some of the biggest polluters along with militaries. And so they play a massive role in the climate crisis too. And through wars and the climate crisis, WTNCs create refugees. They profit off of making refugees. But they also profit again by providing technology to the border agencies that kill and criminalize refugees. So Boeing has contracts with the US military, but it also has contracts with Homeland Security, for example. Next slide. How do WTNCs work? We're going to talk a little bit about their corporate structure here. You can click and click again. Boeing, as you'll see, is at number 3. You can click. There's a few patterns on here I want to point out. The first is that all 5 of these companies, sorry, I forgot to introduce, this is a chart of the top 5 weapons companies in 2021. All 5 of them are based in the US. That seems almost too obvious to point out, but I think it is important because first of all, these companies are based here because the US is by far the biggest buyer, the biggest market for war technology. And they're also based here because the US has incredibly favorable laws towards corporations and really bad regulations to protect workers in the environment. The next thing, you can click, all of these companies made more than 50% of their revenue from weapons, which is, I think, part of what qualifies them as WTNCs. And then you can click one time. The last thing I want to point out is that All 5 of these companies are private. Again, it seems very, very obvious, but also important to note because it's a part of this capitalist neoliberal wealth transfer, right? Where the working class creates value for the capitalist class by having their labor exploited. But these private corporations, these WTNCs, are also making profit from our taxes because those are going to buy their weapons. So private corporations, and especially the CEOs and the shareholders and the board members are becoming incredibly, incredibly rich because they sell weapons, but also because the corporate structure in the US and private property laws allow the extreme accumulation of wealth that we're currently seeing. Next slide. Yeah, so the fact that the US government and capitalists in general are dependent on WTNCs to impose imperialism creates this sort of positive feedback loop between the public and private sectors. This is basically the basis of the military-industrial complex, but what will happen is the DoD, the Pentagon, will write a defense contract. The majority of the time it will go to one of the 5 contractors that he mentioned, so Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin. I put Boeing here as an example because that's what we're focusing on. They'll write a defense contract. Boeing will use the profit from that contract, among other things, to lobby for more defense spending. Lobbying is just legalized bribery, and they lobby directly. They also lobby by donating to the electoral campaigns of legislators. Legislators are also, a lot of them are invested in these companies as well. Legislators are the ones who pass defense spending bills that appropriate ridiculous amounts of money to the Department of Defense, and then the Department of Defense uses that to write another contract. This system is encouraged by and also encourages regulatory capture and collusion between public and private. Regulatory capture is basically where regulatory agencies become so vulnerable to and beholden to the interests of the industry they're supposed to be regulating that they fail to regulate. So an example of this is Lloyd Austin, who is our current Secretary of Defense. Until 2020, sorry, he was a board member of Raytheon. He stepped down during his confirmation hearings because people were like, this seems really corrupt. But the fact that he's no longer on the board doesn't mean he doesn't still know everyone on the board and have influence. So again, like, I just want people to think about what it means that someone who makes money from weapons and all of his friends make money from weapons is in charge of buying weapons for the US government. That's our system. Next slide. Yeah, they are all war criminals. Okay. WTNC supply chains. He promised we'd get back to this, and we will. They have become a national security issue. They're an issue, or they're a matter of national security because, again, they're essential to the maintenance of US capitalist imperialism, their products. And the risk comes from the fact that they have monopolized and outsourced the sector to the point where it has become so chaotic and that's the wrong word, chaotic and monopolized, that it is not functioning properly to meet the demand of the US government. And so we see this dissonance between the profit imperative that capitalists are following and a more regulated, coordinated production that the DoD wants to ramp up production. So yeah, and one thing that you'll see here is one of the reasons these systems are so chaotic is because all these companies have so many suppliers. And Boeing, of all 5, is the most vulnerable. It has the most direct suppliers and the most next tier suppliers. Every single supplier is a potential point of failure. So that's why it's an issue. We can go to the next slide. This is a bunch of article headlines I pulled from like the first page of a Google search that it was just like US defense supply chain problems. A lot of people are talking about this. And the reason that we care, the reason that we specifically care, people who oppose US war, is because these supply chains are critically important in that they provide the material infrastructure to create and maintain imperial capitalism. And they're also incredibly, incredibly vulnerable because, like I said, every single supplier is a weak point. And one disruption can shut down the entire supply line. We care because these companies treat their workers horrendously and they degrade working conditions and also environmental protections for everyone everywhere. And that is linked to the fact that they're vulnerable, right? Like they are vulnerable because they're so greedy, because they're outsourcing so much, and because they're paying workers so poorly. Next slide. So here we're going to look at Boeing's supply chain just a little bit. In general, profit-seeking anti-worker practices define Boeing's supply chain. Their goal is just to increase profits by decreasing costs, and a major cost, probably the biggest cost for them, is labor. They decrease their labor costs by outsourcing. They've tried prison labor. That article headline on the bottom is from 1997 when Boeing built a factory inside a Washington state prison. They also have offshored a lot. So the map on the right shows SEZs in China, which are special economic zones, which are places where the Chinese government has essentially said, we're still in charge here, but we're going to take away a lot or all of the labor and environmental restrictions, enable basically unlimited foreign direct investment. And extract more wealth from the country. China is probably the most famous country for its SEZs, but another example of SEZs is maquiladoras, which are factories on the Mexican side of the US-Mexico border that are US owned and use low wage labor that's mostly Mexican women, often indigenous Mexican women. And in this way, Boeing is taking advantage of the US-led capitalist imperialism that its weapons propagate, which is a direct and important cycle. Next slide. So as we've seen, Boeing creates its own supply chain issues by treating workers poorly, ignoring safety, retaliating against workers, and spinning off as much of its supply chain as it can. Why does it do that? That seems completely illogical. Because the people who are in charge aren't affected by it, right? The issues are not affecting the CEOs or the shareholders that much. And even though they sometimes get bad publicity every few years when one of their commercial planes malfunctions, they still make a lot more money cutting labor costs and paying out the occasional lawsuit than they would reforming their supply chain. And the cartoon on the bottom right is after the MCAS crashes in 2018 and 2019, the former CEO of Boeing got an $80 million parachute. So they don't, it's not affecting them really. Next slide. This is a sort of discussion question. You are welcome to put your answers in the chat, but it's sort of a longer one, so you can also raise your hand and I'll call on you and you can unmute if you want. The question is, can you think of any examples where Boeing products malfunctioned and or hurt people? What happened and what was the media narrative? We probably have time for like 2 responses. And yeah, feel free to raise your hand if you want. Door blowouts, yes, thank you, Zoe. Crashes. Those are probably the main two. They hurt way more people when they operate as intended. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Next slide. The door blowouts and the crashes are the two main ones I'm aware of. So we as consumers tend to mostly hear about Boeing's commercial supply chain, but their weapons supply chain is responsible for more of their revenue, and often it is so interrelated with the commercial supply chain that you can't really separate them. Like 767s are the big crash in Ethiopia, wasn't it? Yeah, there was one in Ethiopia and one in Indonesia, and then lost Malaysian airliner. Didn't know that was Boeing, yeah. And so we hear about these issues on the commercial side all the time. But despite that, they're pretty rare. They shouldn't happen at all, obviously, but they're relatively rare, and passengers are probably the least endangered segment of people who are impacted by Boeing products, right? Because their other products are intended to kill people. When their commercial products malfunction, we hear about it because they're not supposed to hurt people. Their military products, as long as they hurt people, they're doing their goal, right? So you can see, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. You can see on the left here, I pulled two pictures from the Boeing like e-commerce site, which is a really weird website to exist. But these are two of the bombs that have been used a lot by the IOF in Gaza. You can see on this graphic that and it's a very, very incomplete graphic. There's an uncountable number of bombings, airstrikes, invasions at this point. But in the three on here, they used JDAMs, SDBs, and GBUs. We have pictures of the JDAM and the SDBs over here. And I want to highlight the way that they're advertised, right? They're advertised as combat proven. So they've been tested on Palestinians and on other people that the US government has a direct stake in repressing. And the SDBs are advertised as cheap. So they're basically saying on the site, hey, military, you can kill people really effectively for really cheap with us. The review on the top is a review on Indeed of like the workplace environment from the Boeing plant that makes JDAMs. And if you read it, it says frontline managers are laid back and very helpful. Upper management are bean counters and have no idea what's going on inside the plant. The work isn't hard, good coworkers, atmosphere is laid back, no real stress or pressure. It is true that Boeing and other companies like it degrade working conditions for everyone everywhere. It's also true that US workers are very privileged compared to workers almost everywhere else. And people who work at Boeing, especially in engineering, have some of the most highly paid jobs in the US. And so to contrast that with the impact that their work has is a direct example of how US imperialism works and who its targets are, right? Next slide. So like we already talked about, Boeing supply chain issues aren't a flaw in the system, they're an unintended consequence of it. That isn't very clear wording, but what I mean is that it's not the system malfunctioning, right? The system is functioning greatly. The system is designed to create profit for the people at the top. It's doing that. The other stuff is just kind of happening as collateral damage. These two cartoons just kind of show like the way that the US is materially invested in war. Like if you see a war going on, you can just think, who's getting money from this? It's Uncle Sam, right? Next slide. Oh, I missed something I meant to say. Can you go back really fast? Sorry. So what I wanted to draw out here is like there's this contradiction that is inherent to the dilemma the Pentagon is having, which is how do we fix our defense supply chains? And the dilemma is, do the supply chains of WTNCs have to be government regulated in order to propagate the imperialism that allows TNCs to create unregulated global supply chains? It is a hard question to answer, especially when the US government in general, the US public is so opposed to anything that seems even like a little bit socialist, or like nationally coordinated. Next slide. In light of that, DSS 2024 is being hosted. DSS is the Defense Supplier Summit, the Aerospace and Defense Supplier Summit. It's convened by Boeing every year, and it is essentially just networking for the war industry. Boeing gives people the opportunity for vendors, suppliers, business organizations, and actually also government representatives to mingle with each other without any interaction or oversight by members of the public. The first day consists of presentations from senior Boeing officials on supply chain stuff. And after that, there's 2 days of workshops and scheduled one-on-one meetings between potential business contacts. And yeah, Jay Inslee loves them. He invites them back every year. And he's also the person who appoints the regents to UW, as far as I know. So for those who are UW students, for those who are thinking about getting Boeing off campus, you know, it's important to consider these public connections as well. Next slide. This is just a screenshot from the DSS website that is how they match WTNC vendors to each other for their meetings. Next slide. Yeah, Jay Inslee says aeronautics and leaves out the defense part of the title. Another interesting thing, the logo has the aerospace and like the font is like 5 times bigger than the defense. So why are we targeting DSS? This event provides opportunities for Boeing to consolidate the supply chain, for suppliers to land contracts, and for vendors and organizations to make business contacts. Boeing cannot exist, cannot make what it does without its suppliers. It is entirely dependent on them. And while the supply chain is so vulnerable, DSS is more important than ever for Boeing. Next slide. This is a map of the attendees, the vendor participants in DSS 2022. I'm going to go over just some patterns really briefly. The first one is 42% of vendors were from the US, and vendors from the US represented 32 US states. One of the reasons anti-war sentiment is so weak in the US is because some of the only remaining good manufacturing jobs are in the war industry, right? Well-paying. Each supply represents hundreds of people that are economically dependent on war, and each of those people has networks of people that are dependent on them, probably. That makes building an anti-war movement in the US really challenging, and it is also something to think about when you look at how Boeing is expanding overseas, and potentially trying to build up sympathy and goodwill in those places as well. You see a strong representation of capitalist alliances. So 93% of vendors are from NATO allies, and all 3 NAFTA countries are represented. And the last thing is that there's only one supplier from the African continent, from Morocco, even though a lot of the raw materials, Boeing, and the global supply chain in general come from the African continent. Obviously, every other continent has resources that are used in supply chains as well, but they also have production, right? Like their economy is not underdeveloped to the point where its main export is natural resources. So like anti-Blackness and colonialism have led to the purposeful underdevelopment of the entire continent of Africa by Europeans. And there's two places I wanted to highlight in particular about this. He mentioned earlier bauxite, which is what aluminum is extracted from. It's used in like everything, like all the plane fuselages and everything are made out of aluminum. The biggest deposits in the world are in Guinea, in West Africa, and like he said, it is incredibly environmentally destructive and like really poorly paid, poor working conditions, exploitative labor. And this is an example of the way that imperialism creates pools of hyper-exploitable labor, right? The last thing is that, or the other one is cobalt. Almost all of the world's cobalt is in the Congo. Boeing uses cobalt in the batteries in its Dreamliners and probably other products too. And there is a lot of conflict and war in the Congo right now, in big part because the US and other countries want access to that cobalt, right? So that is a today direct example of US imperialism in the service of capitalism. And now I'm going to pass it back off to Heath.
Thank you, Tessa, for giving us that deep dive into the supply chains and how, and more about WTNCs and Boeing specifically, and why this Defense Supplier Summit is so important. I also I think someone asked a question about what happens at some of the workshops. That might be some probably like talking about the specific products, probably having some like simulations and talking about the technology. I think it's a good question because that's a lot of what they're doing is like showing off their different awful weapons to each other and how they could best use them. And also kind of the smaller aspects of that too. Okay, we have just wanting to also ground in the fact that although imperialism feels really overwhelming and wide-reaching, there's also lots of examples of resistance in imperialism. On the top right, Puerto Rican macheteros, direct action against military base, leading to a lot of destruction of planes on the island. In the bottom right, we have, I love this quote from Palestine Action: "The merchants of death are not invincible. Boeing, as a merchant of death, is not invincible." They had a direct action that directly led to a transportation company cutting ties with Elbit System, an Israel-based WTNC, and always also calling into the space lots of the national liberation struggles that are maybe that have happened or are ongoing. I think probably it's always ongoing. Haiti, Philippines, Vietnam. You can put another example in the chat if you'd like as well. Anything that's really coming to mind? Resistance against imperialism. Sudan, India, Hawaii, Mexico. Great. Resist US Led War Seattle. I'll do it in Korea. DPRK. Yeah, thank you. And there's so many more. Y'all can continue. We're gonna go to the next slide here. And also wanting to call out that workers do not support genocide. Just last week, Water Transport Workers Federation of India refused to load or unload any Israel-bound weapons on any ships. We've seen the same kind of resistance in Barcelona and Belgium since the war on Gaza. These are specifically for the war on Gaza. It's happened before in the past as well. And I love this sign this is from Block the Boat in Tacoma, which was, us trying to mobilize against a ship that was bound for Israel. And I love the signs that Free Palestine, and you don't have to follow orders. So yeah, just remembering the power that workers have as resisting imperialism. Gabby everywhere. I love that. Next slide. Am I passing it up? Okay, so yeah, DSS 2024 is more important to Boeing's success than ever. So let's interrupt it. we have a lot, you guys have a lot more information, a lot more context about specifically what we can do or what we're resisting against. So yeah, let's interrupt it. Now I'm going to pass it off. Let's go. I'm going to pass it off to Tracy.
Thanks, Heat. Can we send some love to Heat and Tessa for that amazing teaching? That was so good. So good. Yes, thank you, thank you. All right. How are folks feeling after such an agitating teaching? Let's hear it in the chat. It was fired up, empowered. Yes, we've just went through and broken down all that Boeing and DSS have to do. And what are we going to do about it? Yes, ready to mobilize. Horrible stuff, but love the energy in the chat. Yeah, y'all are great. And that's why we are here. That's why we are putting on this teach-in as part of the No2DSS campaign, kickstarted by ResistSeattle. But as you can see here, with 30 plus endorsing orgs and many more to come, that we are coming together, right, to confront Boeing and protest the Defense Supplier Summit this March 12th through the 14th. As we can see too, like the impacts that Boeing has and that US imperialism has globally means that we also have to come together, right, to confront them. So this campaign coalition is really wanting to mobilize and aiming to mobilize about 1,000 people to confront DSS on the 12th. And also along the way, really expose Boeing as a weapons transnational corporation in order to isolate them. But this campaign coalition is a broad coalition of anti-imperialist, anti-militarism, pro-just peace organizations, and also people that are joining together to escalate this confrontation against Boeing, and also link our different struggles together, and also raise our analysis, right, of weapons corporations to these different neoliberal institutions that maintain US imperialism. And we're also not going to stop there. Our goal is also to build unity towards mobilizing together to oppose NATO and also RIMPAC, which was mentioned earlier in this presentation this summer. Yes. So it's not too late to endorse. We'll have some more information on the next slide if we can go over. Yep. There are all these different ways to get involved in this growing campaign coalition. So you can endorse the campaign as an organization and also join in on a No2DSS committee, because we are a coalition of different grassroots organizations and individuals. We're really working together to build up toward this confrontation against Boeing. And so there are all these different ways to get plugged in. If you go to tinyurl.com/support No2DSS, there's a form you can fill out, and the different committees that you can join include outreach, political education, as well as prop and media. We're also looking for day of volunteers for the 12th as well. So please join us, especially if you're agitated by this teach-in and this presentation. There's so many different ways to get plugged in, to use your talents, your resources, your knowledge, get in touch with folks. So yeah, please definitely check it out and join if you haven't already. Other things you can do include joining Resist US-Led War or another anti-imperialist organization, even beyond this campaign and this confrontation. As I mentioned before as well, we are grassroots organizations. So in order to support any costs associated with the action, and also with the perspective of uniting toward other confrontations, such as NATO and RIMPAC this summer, please consider donating to this Venmo at ResistSeattle to support our campaign work. Yes. Also in the chat, if you Venmo Resist for the campaign, please include a note in the Venmo so they know what it's for. Yes, there are more specific information about the committees. So for outreach, that includes general outreach to our communities about the campaign. We really want to broaden support for this campaign. And also, like this would look like inviting people to different build-up activities, sending emails, texts, physical flyering, etc. For prop and media, this includes really propagating and spreading the calls and exposing Boeing through reaching out to different news sources, writing op-eds, social media posts, physical flyers, and political education is like what we're doing right now, really helping to educate our communities about the campaign, and also, yeah, strengthening our collective analysis as we build up to oppose DSS. So coordinating different build-up education events, fact sheets, and other information as well. So yes, a lot of different ways to plug in. And yeah, would really, really highly encourage folks to check out the tiny URL that's right here. And also mark your calendars and get ready to mobilize with us on March 12th, when more information will be released as the day gets closer. But please definitely join a committee or get in touch with us to learn more. So maybe we can move on to the next slide. As mentioned before, we do have a political education committee and really wanting to sharpen our collective analysis as we build up to oppose DSS. So we are having a political education series, as we have here, which will discuss the conditions of our different communities and how they're impacted by weapons transnational corporations, just like Boeing, and really learn and see how like the struggles that different grassroots orgs are waging against, are learning about how like these struggles are connected. So we just had the teach-in by Resist. Next week, as mentioned before, we are going to have a teach-in on Friday the 1st from 6:30 to 9, Boeing versus Palestine, the People's Resistance Fights Back, hosted by Samidoun, Super, and Palestinians. It is going to be an in-person with a hybrid option event. It is going to have an art build component. So if you like making prop and art, really encourage y'all to show up. The link that you can use to join or to RSVP for that event is tinyurl.com/No2DSS PolEd. So please register, get that on your calendar, as well as the other build up political education events happening on Wednesday the 6th, the Stop the Bombings ED hosted by Bayan and Kaibigan, as well as that same week, Solidarity School hosted by ILPS, International League of People's Struggles. We're gonna have International Women's Alliance, Gabrielle Seattle, and Resist teaming up for an ED, a teach-in then. So a lot of events and a lot of opportunities too to invite your contacts and mobilize your friends out. Let's get as many people out to these teach-ins as we can. and really build up awareness and support for this campaign. So noting time, we do have to move on. We can go to the next slide. Wanted to flash a couple of upcoming events and rallies that are happening, and other ways too that folks, even, you know, in the build up to confronting Boeing at DSS, are continuing to confront Boeing and the different institutions that support Boeing's war profiteering and also US imperialism. So wanting to flash a protest for Palestine that's happening on the 27th at UW Red Square, hosted by the University of Washington United Front for Palestinian Liberation, which is a coalition of student orgs on UW campus that are fighting for liberated Palestine through different demands, such as demanding UW to materially divest from the Zionist entity of Israel, and also cutting ties with Boeing on campus. Also, the next day, Anakbayan UW is also hosting a mass rally, really to demand UW to put students and workers over profit and war, because we see UW blaming the increasing education costs on having to pay their workers like higher wages. Meanwhile, the workers face like stagnant wages and chronic understaffing. But many of these migrant workers are displaced by US-led war and struggle to support their families in this crisis, in the crisis of neoliberalism and imperialism as it worsens. But we see that education at UW is actually increasingly serving as tools of US imperialism, especially against the Filipino people, as we see the US puppet Marcos regime targeting civilians in counterinsurgency operations that use weapons and personnel that are produced by Boeing. So please join us as we demand UW to cut ties with Boeing and actually provide students with pro-people education that affirms people's livelihoods and rights. If we go to the next slide, we also have, again, in this lead up, more upcoming events. So also on UW campus, please join the Black Student Union, Somali Student Union, and the African Student Association in standing in solidarity with the people of Sudan and Congo. So from the genocide that's killing millions of people in the Congo to the war displacing millions in Sudan, also impacted by imperialism and militarism, please mobile and stand in solidarity, happening on Friday, March 1st at the UW Quad. And on March 2nd, please join and show your support with millions of others on the street for Gaza and supporting the Palestinian people in their struggle for liberation in the Hands Off Rafah, Ceasefire Now, Stop the Genocide action. As we know, the Zionist entity of Israel and also the US are threatening Rafah with invasion. Now is really the time to show up and mobilize and continue to shut down for Palestine on March 2nd at 1 p.m. at Denny Park. Ooh, that was a mouthful. All right. Hope to see y'all there, and I hope to continue struggling with y'all. And yeah, looking forward to seeing everyone here bringing their friends, your contacts to these events, and also the next political education opportunity happening on Friday. Don't forget. So if you go to the next slide and the next slide, we're not doing discussion questions, but there are amazing resources on the next slide put together by Resist Seattle. So please check these out. And hope y'all stay in touch. Hope to see y'all in the committees, and let's confront Boeing. Let's shut down war profiteers. No to DSS. Let's go. Woohoo! Thank you, everyone. We'll follow up with an email with more information and recording of the teach-in, but hope y'all have a great night. See you on March 12th. Thank you, everyone.